Hi, everyone. Thank you again for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. With us today is an attorney, Elizabeth Franklin Best. She's an experienced criminal appellate attorney who has spent the last 20 years helping deserving clients reverse their criminal convictions and restore their freedom and their lives. She's the owner and founder of Elizabeth Franklin Best, which is a boutique law firm. It focuses exclusively on federal criminal defense, state and federal direct appeals, federal post-conviction, and habeas proceedings. We are very excited and honored to have her on the podcast. Miss Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, I have looked at your work. It's the yeoman's work without a doubt. And there was a quote on one of your press releases, and it says this: "There are more innocent people in our jails and prisons today than ever before. The rate of exonerations continues to rise, revealing an unreliable system of justice." So let's dive right in. Do you think our criminal justice system is broken?
You know, I do. And I don't say that lightly because I think, and I've had this conversation with a number of other people sort of lately. I mean, it's not that there are necessarily bad actors in the system, and that's why we have the problems that we do. It's that the system itself is just so enormous now that it's not capable of really providing reliable outcomes in a significant number of cases. And so, I mean, by that, what I mean is that, in state court in South Carolina, for example, it's nothing for a judge to have to hear, 8 to 10 guilty pleas in a day and give sentences for, these individuals. And there's no way that this is just a guilty plea. There's no way that a court can really sort of process 8 to 10 human beings through a system and come out with outcomes that are fair or are just. And, when you start looking at sort of the trial system, it's the same kind of thing, right? I mean, you've got this 1 week of trial time and you've got a lawyer. If you're somebody who's indigent, you don't have the money for, like a retained attorney. You've got a public defender who has, a caseload of maybe 300 cases. The public defender is a good person, and no one's going to say that that's not, a good person isn't an experienced person, but it's impossible to have, kind of the quality sort of assessment of, what is happening in that particular case when you've got people who are overworked, when you've got, sort of lack of funds, when you have so many people sort of moving through the system. And to me, that is really kind of where the breakdown is. And this is, I just think, an important point, because I think it's really easy to sort of demonize the police officers or maybe the judges and all these, sort of characters in the legal drama. But people really are, by and large, I think, doing the very best that they can. I just think that the system is such that you're still going to have bad outcomes, even though everyone is trying hard to do the right thing. So that's kind of what I mean when I say the system is broken. We just have too many people going through it. And we have a system that is not capable of handling the large numbers that are going through it.
So on that, two things. One, I'm going to ask you just a little bit about this system and sort of why it's mucking up. The gears are mucking up. But first thing, so I don't forget, as a percentage maybe, or as a whole number, however you can explain it best, what percentage or what amount of people in today's prisons do you think are there, like, righteously they're innocent and they are just, they're serving a sentence that had nothing to do with them per se, or at least that crime had nothing to do with them?
Once upon a time, I thought it was kind of rare, and I think it's probably much higher than what I have believed when I started off this career. I mean, in terms of like a percentage, I mean, even if we're talking 1 or 2% in actual numbers, that's a very large number. So yeah. I don't know. But what I think is also really important about the conversation is that, I mean, it's not necessarily people who are wrongfully convicted who shouldn't be serving these sentences. but also people who are wrongfully sentenced, who are serving sentences that are greatly disproportionate to the harm that they've caused or the crime that they've committed. And
Okay.
I see that quite a bit. I mean, it used to be, let's just go back 40 years, 50 years ago, most people who were serving time in our prisons were there after they lost trials, where their culpability was really sort of fleshed out, where, I mean, it was a trial system. I mean, what
Yeah.
we have now is a plea system. And, when you look at the numbers, and this is like for the last 10 years, or I mean, certainly longer, but I mean, I've been looking lately at some of the data in the last 10 years. I mean, you've got like anywhere between 95, 99% of the cases coming through the system are, resolved by way of guilty pleas. And
Yes.
so when you talk
I was looking
about,
at your post that says that 98.3 98.3 are pled to, they're pleading to guilty, right? So 1.7 are not. So just to
and that was
talk
the
about
year
that.
that, yeah, well, that number was from the year 2021. And so I wonder if whether or not COVID had an impact on that, because I know that they weren't having as many trials. But that's not far off from what it looks like in a
Yeah.
non-COVID year. I mean, it might be
Wow.
97% or 98%. So all these cases are resolving by way of guilty pleas. And so you have to then sort of look, I mean, what's happening at the guilty plea stage? I mean, how are people getting the sentences that they're getting at that point?
Mm.
And what you'll see is that there's just kind of like a lack of creativity. There's not a whole lot of
Oh.
effort kind of given to that. I mean, I've seen and read transcripts of, guilty pleas and sentencings that are maybe 15 pages.
Wow.
So how do express someone's humanity, how they've gotten to this particular place in their lives in such a way that is mitigating, and in such a way that a judge who is asked to dispense a sentence really has the material facts at hand to do justice in those cases. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think when you kind of drill down on this, when you look at a lot of the cases like I do, I'll see some kid who's, 21 years old, did a bad thing, ends up with a 20-year sentence. And you wonder, like, I mean, what is that doing? I mean, nobody's harmed. These are not violent crimes that I'm talking about. I mean, these might be burglaries, drug cases, and the like, where you just see people getting just lit up with incredibly long sentences. And I'm not saying that there aren't some situations where maybe that's appropriate, but I am saying that what I see is that there's no kind of proof that that's appropriate. And there's just this kind of lack of information in the system, and the sentences are just kind of happening and without much thought. And
Well,
so I
okay. So
really,
please.
I'm sorry. No, I was just to say, I mean, I just think as important as wrongful convictions are, I just wish we would pay more attention to sentencing in America. Because when
So
you're
that's,
looking at the number of
yeah.
people who are in prison, that's how most of them got there.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things about these conversations. I never thought about the sentencing. So I'm gonna really dial in that with you a little bit, but just so the audience has some scale for this. So there's about 2.1 million people in prisons. And if Elizabeth is correct, and let's say it's very low, 99% of the time we're getting it right, 1% of the time, or even a little bit less than 1%. That's for every million people, that's 10,000, right? So
Right.
ideally, I mean, not ideally, but quantifiably, there could be 20,000 people languishing in prison wrongfully. So that's just a wrongful conviction. These are big numbers, right? Police take the lives, unfortunately, of about 1,000 people a year, give or take, every year, and every one of those lives gets scrutinized. Imagine if it was 20,000 that we've just
Right.
snuffed out. Because in essence, right, if you're spending a life in prison or 25 years, but this idea of sentencing, so here's what I'll hear. Sentencing tends to be based on criminal activity. Some of the counter arguments, if you will, or other ideas are the vast majority of people are not going to prison. Barry Latzer has a book on this called The Myth of Overpunishment. And there's maybe, I don't know, 30 million arrests for crime, but there's only about 500,000, about 2 million total. So we're not sending a lot of people to prison relative to the crime. So is this pipeline mucking up because criminal activity is more prevalent in your mind, or is it just too many obscure laws?
That's a fascinating question. I think one of the problems, I think sort of one of the easiest areas to kind of look at would be drug distribution. We have made a decision in America that we're going to treat this as criminal activity and not as a public health issue.
Right.
And in so doing, we are putting a whole bunch of addicts through our criminal justice system who perhaps would benefit from some sort of rehabilitation or some other system.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just give you some examples just from some
Please.
of my case. I've got, a guy who's doing 25 years. And there was a significant amount of drugs. I don't mean to sort of minimize that, but he was an addict and was making incredibly poor decisions as an addict. And, in the federal system, it's the weight of the drugs that sort of drive the sentencing in those cases. So, because he was, engaged in poor conduct, he was engaged in this drug distribution because he wasn't thinking well, he wasn't, because he was an addict, he ended up with this incredibly high sentence. But, we really kind of drilled into his life and found, his father had died of a heroin overdose. There was a lot of sort of abuse and neglect. There were profound sort of mental health issues. And had that been addressed 5 years earlier, he's somebody who likely never would have even made it into the criminal justice system. He probably never would have been harming others with his drug distribution. So it's just, and so when we talk about the people, why are there so many people in the system? I think largely because we're putting sort of the wrong kind of people into the system to begin with. When you look back 40 years ago, when you look at, back at the time when trials were the way we were sort of resolving most of our cases, those were for violent crimes.
Mm-hmm.
The decision was made then that we were going to take violent people off the street. And I get that. You want violent people off the street. You want people who harm other people to be off the street. But there are a lot of people who are not harming others who we're also taking off the street. And I just wonder if that's really sort of the best use of resources. I've got 2 guys who were doing life sentences for having sold less than like 2 grams of crack cocaine. But because they were on their 3rd or 4th offense, they were, recidivists.
Right.
They're gone. So the state of South Carolina is paying, $36,000 a year to house a minor drug user.
The scale.
It just makes absolutely no sense. It just seems like such a waste of money, a waste of their lives. And it's just irrational, frankly.
Well, okay. So I want to learn more about your work, but let's make sure you and I touch on what I think needs significant reform, which is the punitive measure of the incarceration system. It seems like I've done a little research. There's other countries that look at this as truly a rehabilitative process. And it's structured a lot more like almost like a military academy where you're going to learn these subject matters. You're going to learn a trade. So when you are done serving your time, you're not just thrusted out there. But before we go there, I'm curious, how do you even go about challenging this monstrosity that is the criminal justice system? How does that look on your end?
So oftentimes it feels like really sort of overwhelming. To be perfectly candid. There are a lot of days where you're just like, what am I? And, I ask myself if even participating in the system is sort of lending it a legitimacy that maybe it doesn't deserve. Those are the conversations I have like on my worst days. But then I turn around and, I make a difference in one client's life. Mm-hmm. I've had clients who we've gotten out of prison. And so for every bad day, I can sort of look at, a particular person and say, would I help that person, get back
for sure
to their lives, And so we have successes, and those successes will keep us going because they are, just so incredibly important, and so valuable. And, a lot of it is just trying. I mean, at this point in my career, because I've been doing this for about 20 years now,
Wow.
I feel like I've got kind of a voice now, I mean, I'm
Hmm.
not like a brand lawyer. I mean, I'm somebody who's sort of been around and seen this thing now. And I mean, I feel like I've got something to kind of contribute to the conversation,
Yeah.
and so speaking out like on forums like this, I think is just so incredibly important. I mean, you just have to kind of educate people about these issues because there's not a lot of education. And,
Right.
so this is something, another kind of big issue for me is, we've got people in the prison system who have just virtually no access to legal materials. I mean, sure, they have law libraries and all the rest of it, but they don't
Hmm.
get the latest up-to-date cases. And, so one thing that we try to do is we send newsletters out to our clients to just kind of keep them up to date on cases and things like that, because I just think that education is really key. And we like to
Hmm.
educate our clients, but we also just think that the community needs to be educated about how the system works.
Yeah.
It's just, I think everyone wants to believe, that everyone in the system is a good actor,
Yeah.
that all lawyers are effective and all prosecutors do the right thing and all cops are clean and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Um, but that's not always true. And so we have to kind of talk about where those elements break down, because people just need to know about it. And, since we've had DNA testing, I mean, that's when like the Innocence Project really started getting, off
Right.
the ground. I mean, because
Yeah.
all of a sudden, it just sort of really challenged that presumption of regularity. It's like, I mean, because of DNA, because of the Innocence Project, like now we know there have been mistakes. For a long time, we just didn't know. We didn't, it, we, no one believed mistakes were happening.
Well, and I for one am a little bit pleased that academia seems to be chipping away at the wall that is law enforcement, because our officers, our detectives, they fall prey to the same cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias and the anchoring effect. They make a determination that this person is the suspect based on
Mhm.
whatever they get. But then any information that comes counter to them, their brain is pushing against or discounting. And you could there's movies made about this at this point. There's one on Netflix called The Long Shot that is,
Hmm.
in my own backyard here in Los Angeles. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. And it's just
Yeah.
interesting because it is complicated. You talked about the early on the idea of like this is all based on humans, and there are limits to humans' potential. And if you're a case carrying public defender that means well and is well educated and well versed in the law, but you also have an inbox to clear because the next cases are coming, why would you not take plea deals? And
Right.
you're going to get compassion fatigue. You're going to get
Yes.
inoculated to all you see are people being put into the system. So you
Yes.
have figured out a way to maintain your empathy. I see officers 15, 20, 35 years, and so on. And it is lost on them the profound experience of putting somebody in jail. It's to me, it's always a very sad event. I mean, of course, there's always, like you say, the really, really bad people. But in general, like what happened in this person's life that made one nudge that pushed them on this trajectory? And now here they are. And it appears as though in this system, there's no coming back from that. Even if you do everything right and you get out of prison, well, now what?
Right. 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 And I mean, all of that is just so incredibly accurate. And it calls to mind, I mean, and this is something I struggle with and I have to sort of step back with. I mean, it is the compassion fatigue. It's
Mhm.
also a psychic numbing. And,
Yeah.
there's something about being like proximate to all of the harm that you see in the system that makes you turn it off. And so
Hmm.
then all of a sudden, you're a player in the system and you just can't even really sort of process the harm anymore. And you
Right.
see this with law officers who I think are, I mean, they are closest to a lot of this. They're the ones who are at the crime scenes. I mean, they are
Yes.
the ones who are seeing when the emotions are particularly high. And I mean, I just think about, PTSD and how line workers, process those scenes. And I mean,
Hmm.
luckily, as a public defender, as a, trial lawyer, you're removed from that. By the time
Yeah.
you got the case, at least maybe a week's gone by. By the
Right.
time you've got to prepare for a trial, maybe a year's gone by. So there's always that kind of softening of the emotions that you just don't have at that very first encounter. And so I'm
Right.
not surprised to hear that police officers, get numb to the idea of there being other suspects and all the rest of it. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes like and it's not to say they're bad people. I mean, this is just what it means to be a human.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there's problems, right? I mean, of course you want to sort of close your damn case,
Right.
right? And move
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Who wants
It's
to live with that, right?
a hundred
That
percent.
pain.
Yeah. And we have lost our ability. It's a big statement. So maybe we are losing our compassion to recognize that a good person can do a bad thing, or
Right.
that an individual is so much greater than the sum of their worst mistakes. Now, I'm holding constant. Let's hold constant the evil that's in the world, the people harming children, these people that go into LGBT clubs and just shoot them out of pure hate, right? So I'm holding constant
That's
people like that.
right.
But like you say, the robbers, the burglars, people that are maybe part of a gang and then they get into a gang shooting, and before you know it, they are in and out of the system. That's all they know. And there's no, I just feels like there's no coming back from it. But with that, then we have to change the whole system then. If we have somebody that's addicted to drugs, there needs to be an entirely different path. And
Yeah.
that takes money, right?
Well, it more than it takes money, it needs political will.
Ah,
I mean, I don't know that it's any more expensive to get somebody into a rehabilitation program than to put them through the criminal justice system.
yeah.
I mean, when you think about housing, and I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at the numbers, but I really do think like in South Carolina, it's roughly, $35,000 a year to house an inmate for a year. I mean, you
Hmm.
can do a lot of rehabilitation with that.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
you can hire a social worker for that. You can get resources in place to
Right.
treat for that.
It is it do you think possibly because crime, I know statistically we are seeing an uptick in crime, and we could look at numbers, and there are victimizations of crime, but in general, the vast majority of society is pretty peaceful with one another. Do you think there is this element of, because most people are not experiencing homicide, the biggest crimes you're going to have are burglary from motor vehicles or some type of trespassing or vandalism. So do you think maybe people have this, they're inoculated from criminal activity. So when they see it, it's like, well, that's, throw the book at them type of thing. I don't want that at all in my neighborhood or in my city.
Yeah, and I mean, and that is, that perception I think is, you know, I think what we see in the media, I think what we see as
Yeah,
entertainment is, supports kind of that view that it's a,
right.
zero sum game, right? I mean, it's the cops
There
or
you
the
go.
robbers. It's the,
Yeah,
and so it's like either or. What we fail to acknowledge is that, the addict down the street is our neighbor and, maybe works at our local restaurant.
hmm,
They're people who we ought to be invested in, but we're not. It's a lot easier just to put somebody in prison and forget about them than to
yeah,
actually sort of work to help that person sort of be in the community with his or her, frailties and moral failings. And, we just have to sort of, support one another more. And, I think people are not inclined to do that right now. I think we live in a society where we've come to sort of fear our neighbors more than we embrace them.
Now, this is a long shot, and just when you said it, the thought popped into my head, so it could be nothing. But do you think there's any relation between the idea that our local churches are less crowded and this sort of non-religious push, the embracing of a non-religious sort of society, is lending itself in some ways that we didn't see? The idea of community, the idea that these are our neighbors. And nowadays, it's like we don't even want to talk with our neighbors as much.
I mean,
Do you
I
think
think,
there's any connection? Go ahead, please.
yeah, I mean, there's no question but that, religion is and religious houses of worship and the rest of it are a very important place where community happens. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I mean, I think that's probably part of it.
It's
Of course,
interesting.
you might wonder if, maybe the reason people are leaving the churches was because they're fearful. I mean, like,
Right.
whether or not it's the horse or the cart.
Right.
Um, and, I mean, but yeah, I mean, community is not what it used to be. I think everyone's kind of sitting behind their computers and their cell phones and are, making TikTok videos instead of playing basketball with, the kids in the neighborhood. I mean, I grew up, so I'm 51. So I mean, we
Me
used to
too.
ride bikes around the neighborhood. I mean, that's what we
Yeah.
did. That was what we did for fun. I've got a daughter who's 13, and I mean, she chats with her friends and she does
Mm-hmm.
TikTok videos, and it's a much less social in some respects kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, I haven't decided whether or not I think it's better or worse in the end, but it's definitely different. And I mean, these things surely must have some impact on, how we're viewing one another. But just,
Yeah.
looking it, one thing that wasn't around when I was a kid that we see more of now are just, crimes as entertainment. And
Hmm.
that's an interesting thing to me.
Can you go on,
That,
explain that, what you think about that?
I
Crimes
mean,
as entertainment.
yeah, I mean, there are all these shows that are on now, right? That are
Oh,
true crime shows. And
yeah.
it it's interesting, right? I mean, it makes me wonder if people think that there's more real crime going on than there is because
Mm-hmm.
it's in your house. I mean, you watch it as
Mm-hmm.
entertainment. Um, I, just a number. The whole thing is just sort of strange. I mean, I'll watch them every now and then, but it's a little too much like work for me.
Yeah. No, I,
Um,
I agree. You're right. The entertainment industry does sort of shape our worldview a little bit, and
yeah, our perception of how common, serious crime
prevalent.
is
Yeah.
prevalent.
So, do people, just kind of going back to your work also, do people reach out to you, or are you actively looking? And then how did you, well, first that, do people look out for you, or do you look? And then I'm curious as to how you kind of got into this, but we'll do the first one if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, mostly, I mean, if somebody's interested in, our assistance in a case, I mean, they typically just kind of reach out either through our website or by giving our office
Wow.
a call, and then we just talk and see if there's something that we can assist them with.
I see.
Um, I mean, there are cases I've kind of gone out and said, you know what, I really want that one. And so
Okay.
I've kind of reached out before because every now and then there's just something that's really pretty interesting. But by and large, people kind of come to us for this.
And then how did you get, well, if you don't mind kind of sharing your trajectory, you come out of law school and you start working where and how you kind of fell
Yeah.
into this. If you don't mind, I'd like to hear that trajectory.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was kind of interesting. I mean, going to law school was sort of a lark. I had a couple of
Huh.
degrees in philosophy and didn't know what to do. So I had a good friend who was in law school, and I was like, what, that sounds like a pretty good idea. So the next year I was in law school myself and didn't
Uh-huh.
really know what I was going to do with it. But
Uh-huh.
at the end of my first year, I got an opportunity to work for our local public defender office, and I loved it. I
Hmm.
absolutely loved it. I mean, it just fit like a glove. And my third year in law school, I was fortunate to be the sort of like the student director of our defender aid clinic. And so I had, was getting kind of like experience with like real clients, and I just loved it. So the idea was to go to New York. I wanted to be just a criminal defense attorney in New York City. So I
Wow.
went to Washington, D.C. to, just kind of study and prepare for it. And that's when 9/11 happened. So I
Wow.
was in
That's where you
Washington,
were.
D.C.
You were out there.
Yeah, I was in Washington, D.C. I was about a block away from the White House when that happened. I was on K
Wow.
Street in 18. And needless to say, I mean, that made it really difficult to get a job in New York City. Okay. Like no one was
Yeah.
hiring in New York City for public defenders at that point. So went up to upstate New York for a little bit and then, just kind of said I was ready to be back in South Carolina. I was ready to be
Mm.
home. I was ready to work for, the people in my community. So I
Hmm.
started off working at the defender office, which was great. I loved it. Went to go work for our state kind of appellate public defender office. So I had a few years there. And then I went and did death penalty work for about the next 8 years, and worked with kind of a group of other just really committed, great capital defenders in South Carolina, a couple cases in Mississippi. And after that amount of time, I was like, you know what? It's time for my next chapter.
Hmm.
And so that's when I started this firm. It's now about 3 years old. And I mean, the idea was to bring just kind of a sort of a high level of creative and aggressive advocacy
Mm.
to guys who are on death row,
Mm.
but just regular guys who were serving time and who just need like a really great advocate. And so we've just grown from there. And we've really stepped into the federal space because honestly, I think there's a lot that we can do in the federal space that we can't always do in the state case,
Mm.
in state cases. I mean, every term, United States Supreme Court is coming down with some change in the federal law. And what we try to do is get our guys the benefit of those changes, as soon as they're happening.
Sure.
Like at least last summer, well, before the end of the term, the United States Supreme Court came out with a case out of called Bruin. It's New York State Pistol and Rifle Association versus Bruin.
Yeah.
And, really kind of changed how Second Amendment regulations are to be construed. And so, how courts are supposed to handle these regulations. And so what we've been doing is seeing if we can raise these firearm challenges on behalf of our clients who have been convicted of firearm challenges. I mean, I think some of
Hmm.
these restrictions are likely not constitutional in light of that case. So that's the kind of thing that we do, just whatever we can to kind of help some of our clients get out from, you know, very serious sentences that have been imposed on them.
So, out of curiosity, have you ever had somebody somebody reached out to you, you looked at the case and you thought, no, this is an individual that is probably, this is where they're supposed to be. I'm more just curious of that.
Um, I mean, I've turned down cases.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm trying to think if I've ever turned down one just because I just didn't like, I mean, I've turned down cases because I didn't like the person. I
Hmm.
don't know that I've ever turned down a case because I thought they were getting what they deserved,
Oh,
you know?
interesting. Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I have to sort of stretch my mind to think about that.
Sure.
I mean, typically, we like to take cases that are interesting.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
really, if you can get me sort of interested in something, I'm like, oh, maybe there's something we could do there. Um, and then just cases where I feel like something really wrong has happened, and I look
Yeah.
these days at these really long sentences, and try to see, is there a way to challenge a sentence?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, that's kind of lately. I mean, there's a lot of what I think of as kind of ineffective assistance of counsel when it comes to the sentencing claims. I mean, there are a lot of arguments that I see that could or should have been made to a sentencing court, to get kind of a lower sentence. And when those arguments weren't made, I see if I can raise like an ineffective assistance of counsel claim as a way of getting it back into court. Just, but this is kind of the area that lately is really just kind of been fascinating to me.
It is.
And I'm
I agree with
thinking
you.
through like ways ways of challenging some of this. I
Yeah.
mean, and I'll tell you, I mean, in the state system, like if you look at your state law on
Hmm.
sentencing,
Hmm.
and I'm sure California is probably like South Carolina. When you look at the case law, and the case law generally says, so long as a sentence is between, the statutory maximum and minimum, then
Hmm.
we're not going to do anything. We're not going to find that any court has ever abused its discretion. The one
Hmm.
exception to that may be, bias. If we think that a
Hmm.
judge is being racist or exercising the right to a jury trial and is being punished for that. I mean, so there's a couple of different ways that you can kind of get around it. But by and large, so long as it's within the statutory minimum and
Hmm.
maximum, that's it. But when you look at that law, that is the law that likely came into existence back when everyone was going to trial. I mean, it was
Oh.
before everyone started pleading guilty. And
Hmm.
so what's happened is that as 98% of our cases are now resolving by way of guilty pleas, you almost have this constitution free zone
Hmm.
because even the appellate courts aren't really looking at what the trial courts are doing when they're imposing these sentences.
Hmm.
And so I think I think it's time to revise the law. I think it's
Yeah.
time that our state courts start paying more attention to what is happening to defendants who are being sentenced. And I think they need to start giving some, guideposts about what
Hmm.
they want to see and the level of representation they want to see when somebody is being sentenced. And it's, we've just sort of gotten to a point where, I mean, our criminal justice system is just it's like a sausage factory.
And
And it's just hard to believe that it's producing the outcomes that are just.
so that I was thinking that as you were talking, it should be the envy of the world. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. Try to tell cops that when they put someone in handcuffs and you say, look, just understand you're taking somebody who's presumed innocent. Like you can't treat them like you shouldn't treat them like a guilty person, even though you're arresting them. And that's profound if you think about how this was created. And now you have this system that is overwhelmed. So it's no longer profound. If anything, we're hanging on like by a couple of threads on each side, and we're just pushing people through to get to the next
Yeah.
batch.
Yeah.
So one answer to this would be, well, let's just expand everything. Let's make more courts and let's have more attorneys. But then do you think that would just exacerbate a problem? It wouldn't alleviate anything.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, the change that would have to happen, I think, is policy based. You just
Hmm.
have to decide who you really want going through the system,
Right.
and right.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the same point, I mean, it's not that they're bad people. It's that the system is taken over, and so
Yeah.
it's like, despite people's best intentions, this is just sort of what we've been left with. Like, I feel like there's no one who just says, whoa, 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 stop. We need to have
Right.
like a really sort of deep, um, analysis of where we are right now. Because, I'm not a statistician, but I sort of suspect that if we stay on this course, we're not going to have, I mean, in less than 50 years, I mean, we're going to
Hmm.
have how many more people? How many more people
Yeah.
are going to be in prison? It's
Right.
like every year it's more.
And you'd say, because I could hear people listening on, I could hear some officers saying, yeah, tell them to stop committing crime and they won't go into the system. So I know it seems
Yeah.
basic, but what do you think of that?
No, I mean, I think, look, violent crime needs to be addressed always.
Hmm.
It just does. I mean, that we have a right to be safe in our communities. But there are a whole bunch of people who are going into prison who are not violent.
Hmm.
And those are the ones who I think we really need to be looking hard at. And again, I'm looking at these recidivist laws for low level drug offenders. I mean, why
Hmm.
is anyone using gram amounts of crack cocaine serving serious prison time? That just makes no sense to me.
Elizabeth, so I've been told this. Okay, so the person with the gram of cocaine, they were actually part of a violent robbery where people got hurt, and they're taking this plea, so they plea out the robbery, and then they end up serving time for the lesser of the crimes. Is there anything to that? I hope
Uh,
I'm articulating that right. Does it make sense how I said it?
no, 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 no. I mean, plea bargaining definitely has a role in this conversation.
Okay.
Um, I guess what I would say is that if the prosecutor cannot get a conviction for the armed robbery, they've got a real
Oh,
problem. Maybe this isn't the
oh.
right guy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
That's
so
interesting.
they shouldn't be, maybe they shouldn't be pleading it down, but just dismissing the case.
Mm.
Um, I mean, if I mean, around here, and I mean, I'm sure this is like it is everywhere. If there's a strong case, a prosecutor is going to prosecute it. They don't
There,
uh, see many. I mean, I don't see many plea offers in violent crimes. What I do
there's
see
no
plea off.
incentive. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, what I do see are plea bargains when there are weak cases.
I wouldn't know that. That's incredible. Is so there really is no incentive. Excuse me. There is no incentive for a prosecutor to plead this out.
I mean, I'm a criminal defense attorney, not a prosecutor, but I just do
Fair.
not know that prosecutors deal out serious cases unless they have serious problems with those cases. Um,
It's a great point.
Otherwise, you just, yeah, I mean, once upon a time, I mean, so we had this prosecutor here in Columbia, and I mean, he would come back with an offer of like 5 years on a homicide. And it's because they
Mm,
had huge problems with the case. They
yeah.
had huge, I mean, you take that case to trial and maybe the guy goes free, you know? So that's why you would get those sorts of offers. And I mean, I just sort of laughed at that because we don't see anything like that anymore.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
but
So
yeah,
interesting. Have you, this is random, but I've been listening to this. In doing some research, having a discussion with you, I came across a podcast called In the Land of Lies. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
Okay. It's the Michael Chappell story that happened in Georgia in the 90s.
Huh.
I
Okay.
think you will be fascinated by this because I'm just looking at different things, trying to I want to see what your work is doing, and I listened to a few TED talks, but I came across this, and then I fell down the rabbit hole of listening to this podcast because it was addictive. It's basically the story of a broken criminal justice system that is working against a police officer who.
Uh,
I mean, I'm on episode 9 of 10, and I don't want to give it away for people, but let me just tell you: did you ever watch Serial, or did you ever listen to Serial? That
oh,
one.
yes.
Right. So
Yes,
everybody
yes.
knows Serial. This is very similar to season 1 of Serial. And you
Okay.
listen to it, and you know how you were going back and forth with people. I think you'd find this if you do any podcasting for someone in your line of work. I think you would find this interesting. I bring this up because this is now becoming a source of entertainment. These
Mhm.
potentially wrongful trials, right? What your work that you've been grinding away at is now
Mhm.
becoming, top 10 podcast. Do you see a shift in societal recognition of this, right? You're on a podcast now talking about it from where you started. Are you seeing a more of an awareness taking place?
Oh, absolutely. I
Ah,
mean, yeah. So I started my career back around 2001. And I mean, that is when people got convicted, they got their life sentences, and then they went off to do whatever. I mean, and it
mhm.
wasn't until probably the last 10 years, maybe even less, that people are now just more aware of, that things go off the tracks. And again, I mean, I
Yeah,
think it just has taken that much time for, the Innocence Project. I mean, it started off with sort of a handful of wins, but now they're in every state. I mean,
yeah,
every state can say, we had this happen here. That wasn't the case for a long time, but I mean, just gradually, and gradually, every state in the country has its list of exonerees, and people know
right.
about it. So,
Right.
and that's a lot of value in podcasting and, just sort of illuminating these stories.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of people just don't, until sort of our lifetime, people just didn't believe that these things happened. So I've seen a
Right. You
huge
just
shift.
assume. Yeah. Do you,
Yeah.
is there, so if we're going to try to fix this, all right, because you're doing the work, but if we're going to try to fix it, would you say put forth the effort for the young attorneys coming up and the policymakers and the politicians coming up? Should our focus be on the sentencing and maybe starting to look at alternative sentencing or a reduction in sentencing before we start fixing the prison system in general? What would be the
I
bite we
think,
can take?
yeah, I got a good answer for this because I
I
don't
love
think
it.
it's and I don't think it's a hard fix at all, frankly. I think
Uh,
if you just had like a bill, if you just had some legislation in place that would allow a sentencing judge to reconsider a sentence based on a person's conduct in the Department of Corrections or the Bureau of Prisons, based on their programming, the
mm,
development of their character, whatever the person, wants to present as, a testament to his or her character. Just give that judge an opportunity to revisit that sentence. And I bet you anything, there are a number of them who would revisit those sentences after a sufficient
interesting.
amount of time. Yeah, I mean,
So
because here's the thing. Again,
please.
judges want to do the right thing. That's been my experience. I think by and large, judges want to get it right, but oftentimes they're not given the information that they need to do the right thing. And it may
Hmm.
be that, you've got a judge who sees this 20-year-old, he's terrified this kid is going to go out and, if he doesn't go to prison, he's going to get out back on the streets, he's going to kill somebody. Well,
Right.
what if that 20-year-old goes into the Department of Corrections and at age 35 has a spotless record? Maybe he's
Yeah.
written a book. Maybe he's been, taking care of the infirm prisoners in the hospice ward. Maybe he's been leading Bible studies. Like maybe he's been doing everything right since he's been in the Department of Corrections. Why shouldn't we be revisiting that sentence?
Well, and then you're incentivizing good behavior, right? You're
You're making
incentive. Go ahead, please.
making it so much safer for the correctional officers who are in the prisons, and you're incentivizing the behavior. It is such an easy, quick fix, and I think it could just result in so much good. Um, you know,
It'd be
it just
interesting.
takes a little creative little fixes. You don't have to revamp the whole system. You can start sort of making some inroads around the periphery, and even just doing that would change so
Yeah.
much.
So, and I don't say this lightly, and I've been trying to think of a way to say this articulately without sounding condescending or whatever. I don't mean it that way, but here's what I'm going to say. I'm just going to shoot it out here. Inmates in prison are incredibly creative at solving problems. And you look at how they create electricity, how they make alcohol. Like they find ways to circumvent and whatnot. So my point is this: you get a bunch of people together who are very creative. We should channel that creativity. And imagine if we gave certain correctional facilities problems to solve. Like, let's put all that creative energy you have, let's give you some resources, and let's try to fix this, whatever it is. Here's a solar panel that can't retain energy for long. Here's all the material. Work together collectively to come up with a better solar panel or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you in some way? I know I
Oh
haven't
yeah.
flushed out the idea, but it just seems like there's untapped human potential. How about that? That's how I think we could say it. And we look at them as less than because they commit a crime, but they could be very good at solving issues or very good mechanically. And we're not tapping into that as a society.
That's absolutely right. And a lot of that is because, there are people we're putting in the prison system who just shouldn't be there. There are a lot of the people who are in the system, educational problems, poverty issues. We're, the people, by and large, the people that are populating our prisons come from a certain kind of socioeconomic background. That says nothing about their intellect,
Yeah. And their
and
potential.
so
We don't know their potential.
potential. And so you may have people who are in prison who may be rough, but they're also leaders, right? I mean, you may have some gangbanger who's in there who also has a lot of leadership skills. I mean, if you can sort of tap into that, focus
Yeah.
it. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, they're
Mobilize
human.
it in the right way.
Right, right.
Yeah, we're not doing enough with this. I hear a lot about police reform, and I often push back on that because I think about if you're going to reform policing, you're going to change everything, and it sounds to me like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, prison reform, I get behind right away because all we're doing is punishing people. Like, let's not just punish them, but let's help them not make this same mistake again because a lot of them come from broken homes where there was no parenting. The streets were the parents.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So let's channel that
Yeah.
and let's make them, not make them, but let's encourage them to realize that they are more than who they think they are, an inmate, if you will.
No, that's right. And it's always kind of amazing to me because I'll come across some inmates. I mean, and how much they develop as they're in there and the kindness that they show. And here's just a quick story from like South Carolina's death row. But I mean,
Please.
There's an inmate in there who is profoundly mentally ill, just profoundly mentally ill, and cannot, take care of himself, his hygiene. And so it's another death row inmate who takes care of him. The correctional officers don't want to do it. They don't want to go into his messy cell. They don't want to do anything like this. But, this other death row inmate, the worst of the worst, has, assumed the role of this person's caretaker, and he tends to, I mean, it's just this incredible sort of act of violence, not violence, incredible act of just altruism and goodness.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just who this.
Yeah, they're death row inmates. Like the incentive for them to be good tends to be low. It's from what I understand, if you have a life in prison, that's a dangerous inmate to have to deal with if you're a prison guard. What more can you do to them at that point? Right? And now you have one that's showing compassion with what little compassion is in that environment. They're figuring out a way to give their life meaning. Like we need to tap into that. This is somebody we need, maybe they don't get out for whatever reason, but can you still teach a class? Can we still educate you? And talk about life experience as a professor. I mean, I know I'm reaching, but we're just not tapping into this enough. We're losing valuable human capital.
Oh, I think that's absolutely accurate. Yeah. At great societal cost. I mean, for every person that we are putting in prison, you are damaging a family. You are removing somebody from a community who adds some value to that community. I mean, and so, that kind of harm gets into your DNA. I mean, it's something that it continues to be felt generationally. And so, we ought to be thinking much longer and much harder before we remove people from their communities.
So especially, please finish your thought, please.
I would say, just especially for these drug offenses. I mean, I keep going back to that, but that's what most of the cases in prison are. I mean, most of them are drug offenses.
Well, and Elizabeth, this is an issue too. If you have laws that leave no room for interpretation. Let's say I'm an officer and I catch somebody with this narcotic on them. I am mandated that I shall make this arrest. I can't take this item, destroy it, and say, get your act together. I'm taking you home or I'm taking you to the clinic. Like I'm not allowed to do that kind of intervention because now I'm destroying evidence. Now I'm breaking laws and I'm supposed to enforce. Like I'm not allowed to do it. And maybe we need to revisit what we want. We want our officers to be more members of the community and, maybe absorb some of those mistakes for these young people. Can I stop this one act from happening that doesn't send you on a path? Because now I book you on this. And now I send you into a system where I've heard this before. Maybe you have too. It's like a phrase, we're taking people who made mistakes and turning them into criminals, but by putting the wrong people in prison. It's something like that, correct?
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I mean, it would take a different, I mean, again, sort of a policy shift. Get to give sort of the line officers like the discretion to handle certain offenses.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are a lot of prosecutors who probably would not at this point be comfortable with that discretion. And I mean, I still think in law enforcement, we still, we have a system that likely rewards officers for being, good
Productive.
officers, productive, and that's arresting people and making their cases. And I mean, there are a lot of incentives, right, to be more aggressive.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm hoping we're going to have more of these conversations. But as I look up to wrap up your time, what are some action items or some words of advice you could give to the line officer from this? Is there anything we can do at this level that can maybe impact?
Yeah, I mean, so much you could do, really.
Oh,
I mean, I think probably number one is just, when you're on the streets and you're seeing like young kids who are on the edge, right? I mean, just they need to know that you're their friend,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're not the enemy. I think just opening up kind of dialogue and, reaching out and trying to kind of move beyond some of these stereotypes. And just remember that that's a human and, you want to be treated like a human. I wish that, that would just sort of be it. I mean, there's just such a kind of a lack of humanity, I think, on sort of both sides of it, and that's just kind of part of the zero-sum game, that's the cops and the robbers. And what we really need to do is sort of move away from just that paradigm. And just sort of, when we see a kid who's in trouble, it's like, look, dude, we want you to remain in this community. You're valuable. Let's just sort of see how we, get you back on the straight and narrow.
Yeah. I like it. I like it a lot. It's good advice. And let's start looking at measuring good policing, taking a kid and keeping them from getting into the gang where they may do a drive-by shooting is just as valuable as arresting the kid who did the drive-by shooting. You and I would argue more valuable at this point.
More valuable. Because then you don't have the societal harm, right? I mean, the goal here is to prevent that societal harm. Mm-hmm. And you can just sort of get to these kids before they commit these acts. I mean, not only are you preventing that societal harm, but you're also preventing the additional societal harm of removing that kid from his community. I mean, the best way for these communities is just to stop crime before it happens and do so in a way that really sort of treats the individual as something other than a criminal who's incapable of, being of value.
Yeah. And they're not being told that enough. And so they're finding value in their criminal activity.
Yeah.
Well, Elizabeth Franklin Best, it has been my honor to have you on the show. Please keep in touch with us here. And if you have any work that you're working on or things you want us to highlight, you reach out to us. And I'm looking forward to having you back next year to see what progress you've made in the year to come.
Well, thank you so much for this program. I just think it's a really valuable contribution to, what is a larger issue. And I mean, is going to continue to be an important issue. So
thank you so much for being part of it. Yes, I appreciate it. And we will see you next time. Okay.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.